This week in Truth Culture, we're taking a look at the movie Shazam and nihilism in film. All right, well, let's jump right into it. This week I got to see the movie Shazam. And for DC movies of the past couple of years, it's been up and down. This movie is definitely on an up. In fact, I'm just going to tell you right from the beginning what my grade average, or not grade, but my score for this movie is a 7.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed this movie. I liked it a lot. It's very funny. It's not a family movie though, because as lighthearted and humorous as the movie is, it's also just as dark. In fact, I don't want to give out spoilers, but there's this boardroom scene. And if you've already seen the movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it is pretty intense. And it's interesting because you're kind of wondering, well, who is this movie for? But overall, it is a very lighthearted movie that actually has a good, positive message that you don't see in movies these days. And I was actually generally surprised to see that in a film. The basic premise is basically that a wizard gives a power to a boy. And when he says the name Shazam, he turns into a superhero. And what's interesting about Shazam is, last time I had the show, we were talking about the connection between superheroes and gods. And Shazam, I got it right over here, literally means, if you break down each letter, it's the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed of Mercury. And we talked about how Flash is actually based off of Mercury. But, even though that's there, they don't really talk about that much. In fact, the character very, if at all, shows anything of the wisdom of Solomon. And it's a very lighthearted movie for the most part. I was really impressed by the themes of this movie because usually superhero movies focus a lot on humanism and the power of self and discovering who you are. And this movie actually focuses on the strength of family and working with each other in order to overcome a problem, or in this case, evil. And that was actually a nice, surprise, because usually that's not the message of movies. In fact, that was very much, the focus of self and the power of what you can do was very much the story focus of Captain Marvel. And Shazam has a completely different focus on working with others. And I really appreciated that. As far as DC films go, I would definitely say this is a good movie. I still like Wonder Woman a little better, but I think the third act of Wonder Woman's a little weak, and I felt that the third act of Shazam was actually the strongest part of the movie. So it's a good balance, but overall, if DC keeps making movies like this, they're going to get back on track and get to the quality that Marvel already has. But right now, I would say Shazam, go check it out if you can. It's a good time. However, if you're trying to take your family out to the movies, this is not family appropriate. I would recommend that no kid under 13 should see this movie just because of certain scenes with the villain are quite intense. And I couldn't imagine watching those when I was under the age of 10. They would probably give me nightmares. I mean, it's really that intense. Merging into our topic for today, which is nihilism. And usually it's in some pretty creepy movies as well. Let me give you a basic definition of nihilism. And basically, it's that everything is meaningless. And one of the things, with truth culture, what we want to look at is looking at our culture and understanding the meaning that's behind certain things from a Christian perspective. And with movies, you really got to ask yourself, what's going on in this movie? What is the message of this movie? And nihilism is in a lot of films these days and actually has been around for quite some time. Let me read you a more in-depth definition of nihilism. Is the philosophical viewpoint that suggests the denial or lack of belief towards meaningful aspects of life. Most commonly, nihilism is presented in the form of existential nihilism, which argues that life is without objective meaning, purpose, or really any sense of value. And so basically what this is saying is that, there's really no right and wrong. And oftentimes another definition of nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles and the belief that life is meaningless. And, you look at that and you're like, wow, that's That's kind of depressing. I mean, if you actually believe in nihilism, that means nothing really matters. There's no meaning behind anything you do. Everything you do is ultimately going nowhere. So I guess enjoy the time you have, maybe, if that's even what you want to do. But it's really depressing if you really stop and think about it. And there's a lot of movies that use this. In fact, I just want to read off a few notable films that are connected with nihilism. In 2000, American Psycho came out. 1964's Doctor Strangelove. 1971's A Clockwork Orange. 2007, No Country for Old Men. 1996, Fargo, which went on to go into a TV series. And also, the one that I'm most familiar with is actually 2007's There Will Be Blood, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And if you watch that movie, it explores capitalism, the abuse behind the oil industry, the abuse of the Christian culture. And at the end of that movie, man, you leave the theater depressed. It really is a heavy film. Daniel Day-Lewis does a great job acting in that movie, but it really makes you think hard about why we do what we do and where does everything amount to, where does it all go. And at the end of the movie, Daniel Day-Lewis's character, there's not much to his life, even though he acquired everything he wanted. It means nothing. That's pretty much the end of the film. In horror movies, you'll see nihilism a lot. A couple of examples is Saw, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And sci-fi horror, you see it in Alien, Predator, where ultimately these movies convey that there is no meaning. What's interesting is if you look at it from a horror movie perspective, horror movies work really well with nihilism because in a world where everything is meaningless, you have no right and wrong when you're in the situation of not knowing what's going to happen, and horror works really well in that structure. But I want to talk about a very important writer who had a huge impact on books and on movies and on video games, and his name is H.P. Lovecraft. And he was someone who used nihilism a lot in his stories, but he came up with a concept called cosmic-ism. And I'm going to read you a definition of this so you can understand what it means. It's the literary philosophy developed by the American writer H.P. Lovecraft, stating that there is no recognizable divine presence, such as God, in the universe, and that humans are particularly insignificant, that we're insignificant in the larger scheme of intergalactic existence. What's interesting is if you take nihilism, which means there's no meaning to life, and you take cosmicism, which means that in the grand comparison of the universe, we're nothing, and you put that together, that actually kind of represents the viewpoint of science and mainstream secular science. In fact, nihilism and cosmicism goes really well with people who are atheists. If you don't believe in God, nihilism fits in really well. And it's also a common view that the earth is insignificant in the universe when compared to the universe itself. And so what's so interesting is that H.P. Lovecraft in the late 1800s put a lot of these themes in his literature. And you see it play out in horror movies especially. These type of horror movies do not recognize the supernatural. And if anything, they recognize that what we would call the supernatural is actually scientifically possible. Maybe it uses aliens or some sort of multidimensional being, but they don't see that there's a supernatural existence to the universe. In fact, it's very materialistic. And H.P. Lovecraft brought that into a lot of the common things that we see in movies today and also in video games. Alien is a perfect example of that. Cosmicism works well when you take somebody and you put them in a situation that's completely alien to them, and it's the worst, horrible situation. And what you find in that situation is that we're not equipped to deal with the unknown. And in those type of horror movies, the unknown is what is most scary. And in those films, we're not prepared to deal with it, and horrible things take place. Personally, for me, I don't like watching horror movies because I usually leave the movie going like, oh my gosh, that's awful. Like even if the main character survives, it's like, good job, you luckily survived that, even though all these other people got killed. And usually there's just not a lot of meaning in those movies. Most of those movies are just kind of a thrill. In fact, I know a lot of people, and I have friends who love horror movies, and they get an adrenaline rush when they watch them. It's not about the message of the movie, it's the fact that they feel helpless, they don't know what's going to happen, and if the movie is done properly, they can get a jump scare, they get shocked by what they see. There's an adrenaline rush that's there. But if you really stop and you think, okay, what was the point of this movie? What did I take away from this film? A lot of these movies actually are advocating a nihilistic worldview that nothing matters, that you're insignificant, and the mere fact that the main character survives is just by chance. There's nothing more than that. However, in horror movies that do deal with the supernatural, that position is that this supernatural entity is greater than you are and is actually has power over you. And that's actually a slightly different message. It's actually an upside down message from Christianity, but it actually does say that there's meaning in the universe, just not from the perspective of good that you would find in Christianity and other religions. What's interesting is I want to look at three concepts real fast on top of nihilism. I want to look at three. I want to look at nihilism, humanism, and theism. And humanism is basically the notion that man is the center of the universe, that all things are measured to the standard of humanity, and we derive morality and other values from that. What's interesting is humanism doesn't fully work with horror films, because if man is the center of everything, everything works for man. It works great in other movies, but usually it's not going to be a main theme in horror films. Theism places man in a position under a higher being, God or gods, or something supernatural. And this is something that you'll see a lot in horror movies because it'll play off of the power of the supernatural to scare you. A good example of this is the movie The Exorcist. If you watch that movie, it is terrifying. It's really scary. And even though the demon is cast out by the power of God, you don't walk away from that movie and saying, wow, the power of God is amazing. You walk away from that movie going like, oh my gosh, I was scared out of my mind for 2 hours. And the reason why is because it focuses on a supernatural power of evil and how these particular people are helpless to that power. And at the end, they overcome it. But what overcomes it is not the focus of the movie. It's actually the evil itself. In fact, The Exorcist was so scary that when it came out, my dad was telling me he knew people who could not sleep well for like 2 to 3 months because it was so terrifying. Because that movie's purpose wasn't to showcase the power of God. It was to showcase the power of evil. And then at the end, it's cast out and then they survive. But I remember that movie just happened to be on TBS when I was younger in high school. And I didn't really know much about it. And it was the TV version of it. I watched it, and I guarantee you I had a hard time sleeping that night. I mean, it stays with you because it's focusing that we're people under a greater power. And in this movie, that greater power is the power of evil. And so you'll see that a lot in horror movies work well with theism and nihilism. But horror movies don't work well with humanism. And like I said, you may see some threads of humanism. You could argue that, well, you see how the human survives at the end. It's because the human is greater. But usually in most horror movies, it's not that the human was greater. The human was actually lesser. And by circumstance, luck, or a loophole, they're able to overcome or defeat this higher power, whether it be an alien or a supernatural force. What's interesting about nihilism is nihilism says there is no right and wrong. It has this very plain and empty view of the world. And some people are actually mistaken it for the postmodern view of morality. And let me clarify those. The postmodern view of reality is actually more of, well, what is right for you that's right for you, but it may not be right for me. What's wrong to you may not be wrong to me. Postmodernism just makes morality very all over the place. It's in the eye of the beholder. Nihilism just settles and says, look, if you want to live by some sort of standard, that's fine, but just understand that true reality, there is no right, there is no wrong. Everything is meaningless. Nothing matters. I was watching clips of TV shows that even focus on this, And occasionally you will have a character who is nihilistic in a show, and maybe that show is not necessarily nihilistic, but the character will be like, nothing matters. You just might as well just enjoy the time that you have. You don't know how long you have. You might as well enjoy it. And then when it's over, it's over. I saw an interview with a famous celebrity, I won't say who, but towards the end of her life, they were asking her, do you believe in afterlife? And she said, I don't know. And the person says, well, do you want there to be an afterlife? And she says, well, it would be nice, but I think I would only want an afterlife if I could have things my way, you know? And so basically she was okay with the fact that when she dies, that's it and that's over. And that's a growing perspective that actually comes from a growing perspective in our culture. You don't have to be an atheist to believe in it, but atheism sure does help for that to cultivate. And just accepting and being okay with the idea that after you die, that's it. What's bothersome is that this is a very popular form that we see in cinema. In fact, the movies I listed earlier that were not horror films, a lot of them are Academy Award-winning films. They get a lot of attention, they're praised for their points that they're trying to make. And they're considered to be some of the top. In fact, a couple of these, let's see here, Doctor Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange, those movies are actually on the top 100 list of the greatest movies of all time. But as a Christian, when you look at these movies, you're going to be a little bit bothered by watching them because as a Christian, we believe in the exact opposite of nihilism. We believe that there's meaning. We believe that when we die, that's not it. We believe that this is actually just the beginning. In fact, one of the greatest things about Christianity is that it gives us hope. There is hope after this life. We don't believe horrible things happen for no reason. We believe they happen and that God can use those bad circumstances for his good. We find meaning in all things. Even if we make mistakes and we're responsible for the problems that we have, we believe that God can take that and make it better. Suffering, from a Christian perspective, suffering for doing good means something in the greater scheme of things, because if we suffer as Christ suffered, there's good that comes from that. The world that we have today is not all there is tomorrow. We believe in eternal life. We believe in meaning because there's a God who created all things. He created the earth. He created mankind. He has a standard by which we want to live by. God determines what is good, what is evil, and as Christians, we hold to those beliefs and those teaching. As a Christian, I believe strongly in right and wrong. I believe strongly in meaning, and I believe strongly in God. And as a result of that, I don't walk away from a movie fully depressed that's nihilistic, because I know that movie is depressing. It says life is meaningless. It's a good thing that I know one thing, that's just not true. But I got to shake off that mindset that movie is trying to impose on me and realize, hey, you know what? There is meaning. And at the end of all things, we will be judged by a God who is very much concerned about the choices that we make and who we make them for. As Christians, if you do go to a movie together and you happen to notice these themes of nihilism or a message saying that we're insignificant, we're not of any value, talk about it. Talk about it with your friend and say, you know, do you really think that's right? Do you really think it's true that we're just a little speck in the universe? We don't mean anything. And there's so many things out there that are in the unknown that are just there to destroy us. And we're insignificant, like a person who sees an ant. We're that ant. They can just step on it and could care less. And really, is that healthy to think that way? Some people in the science department say that to have a true view that the earth is a small thing in a vast universe is actually properly the proper perspective of humility, you know. And I would say that's actually incorrect. I believe the proper perspective of humility is not to believe that you're insignificant and nothing. It's to understand that there's a God who created you. He has created a standard by which we are to live by. We are to accept his son, Jesus Christ, as our Savior, and we're supposed to submit to his rule. To me, that's true humility, not saying that we're nothing, we're insignificant, nothing means anything, just do what you want. In fact, if anything, that leads to not leading to humility, because you're not willing to submit to the rule of God, because you've dismissed the belief that there is a God in the first place. But be aware of these things. I don't see nihilism in a lot of kids' movies because it wouldn't be kid appropriate if you show your kids shows where everyone's just depressed. There's no meaning to anything. So usually you don't see nihilism in it. However, you do see movies that may be put together from a nihilistic view. One that kind of comes close that I saw, I think in 2000, was it 17? Yeah, that's right. In Christmas was The Last Jedi. They were playing with the theme of, well, what if the good and the bad come together and create kind of this new zone? And while The Last Jedi is definitely not a nihilistic film, I wouldn't be surprised if the person who put together the script might have some nihilistic views of kind of a neutrality and morality, and maybe things aren't really what we thought as far as meaning goes, and really kind of questioned those things and shook it up. And it made for a very interesting film where you almost feel like good and evil are coming together. And it's like, what is that really Star Wars? Because traditionally Star Wars has not been nihilistic. It's been very clear that there's good and there's evil, and the good guys are always on the light side, and the bad side always has the villains. But it's something to think about. And as a Christian, I see nihilism more and more as I become aware of it. I see it in television. I see it in films. While I may watch a movie like There Will Be Blood that is nihilistic, I do my best to avoid horror movies that are focused on nihilism. And I try to avoid horror movies in general because I never get anything good out of those movies. When I walk out of a horror movie, I usually feel awful. And it's like, what did I just watch? And so as Christians, be aware of what's in the film. Be aware of what it's trying to communicate. And have conversations with your friends about, well, what's the purpose of the movie? What do you believe? Do you think that things are meaningless? Do you think there's a purpose in life? Do you believe there's a God? Film can be a great way to start a conversation about who God is and what does that mean in our lives. Well, that concludes this episode of Truth Culture. Next time, I'm actually going to go into some cultural views of how we see Christianity and maybe a misunderstanding of Christianity. So stay tuned to that. I look forward to sharing with you some basic misconceptions of Christianity and the American culture. Thank you, and have a great day.